welcome to Sacred Justice, a podcast that features discourse rooted in the pursuit of justice as sacred practice. Our weekly discussions reflect on current events, art, media, theology, and how they intersect with the movements for freedom and liberation. We hope that through these conversations, we can foster inclusivity by expanding our learning opportunities. We hope to cultivate digital community beyond the confines of our campus. And we hope to reconnect the church's social and spiritual callings. Join us for the journey. Welcome back to Sacred Justice. We are on episode 7 today. I am Mia McLean, and I'm here with
Ben Boswell.
DJ.
No. DJ Hairless is retired.
Yes, the Benjamin Boswell. We are here, and we are here for another episode. Ben, how are you today?
It's hot.
It's hot.
It's a hot one. It's hot. A lot of things making me hot, not just the weather, but it's a hot one. It's a hot one.
Yes. Yeah. I forgot. I don't remember last summer being this hot, but maybe because we were all inside. So I don't remember this, but
it wasn't this hot this early last year. This is hot for May. We're in May, right? Well, you might be listening to this podcast and it's June, and you're saying you thought it was hot in May. Now look where we are.
Yeah.
Oh man.
So anyway, welcome back. I'm well today. It's hot and been sort of running around town. So I'm feeling as we begin to move into a routine that's more familiar of yesteryear, pre-COVID, there's all of this activity that at least I wasn't used to. And so I'm feeling a certain kind of fatigue that I'm just trying to be careful with. I don't want to go back to pre-COVID busyness and overbooking calendars and things like that. I'm not trying to go back to that.
I mean, managing a hybrid work calendar plus, because like the stuff that was on Zoom isn't done yet. They still want to be on Zoom, all over the world and places, and then even here locally, and then you got to do the in-person stuff. So my dog's confused, and when my dog's confused, I know my life is messed up. My dog's like, "Where are you today? Are you here or are you going somewhere?" And I'm all over the place.
Yeah.
Oh, I'll tell you what helped me though today, and you'll appreciate this. I went to a restaurant for lunch in Huntersville called the Lost Cajun. And it's all New Orleans themed, and it's got some character. And I'll tell you what, some of their jambalaya was on point. Some of it was on point. So
I'll have to be the judge of that.
I will say the po' boy was a little dry, and it could have done a little bit better on the po' boy. I had an oyster po' boy, but the soups were, I thought the soups were right.
Like by soup, you mean like gumbo? What do you mean like?
They had gumbo. They had a couple of other different kinds of soups. A couple of seafood soups. They had regular gumbo and then a seafood gumbo, and then they had couple of other different kinds that were spicier. I got like the spiciest one. It wasn't spicy, so it needed more hot sauce. They sell their own hot sauce and stuff there too, which is kind of cool. But yeah, I know with that New Orleans, you got to go check these places out.
I have to verify that they are worthy of the title.
It's worth going up there just for the theming. It will make you feel at home.
Okay, all right, I'll go up there soon. So today we have a lot on the docket, but there is so much happening in the world, and in this podcast, we like to make sure we're always connecting the dots. So what's happening in current events is not just a news story sometimes, but it does connect to our faith journeys and our spirituality and our work toward justice always. So Ben, what is on your docket for current events that's a must talk about today?
Must talk about today. First thing on my docket, must talk about today is I would just say I'm impressed with the work that I'm seeing from the Attorney General of New York right now, Letitia James, who has exposed the corruption of the NRA, and it looks like the NRA is going to have to either move to Texas And even when it moves, it's not going to be the same organization it once was. And all of this is because she investigated Wayne LaPierre, the head of the NRA, who had been basically using the organization as his own slush fund, in addition to his $1.8 million salary, which, by the way, the NRA is a nonprofit organization. No, thank you. But because they're organized as a nonprofit in New York State, they are under General James's jurisdiction, and so she has. And then they tried to. LaPierre, without telling anybody on his board or his general counsel, declared bankruptcy as a way to save his own tail. But it backfired, because then a judge said, you can't use bankruptcy like that. Y'all have $500 million in the bank. That's not bankruptcy.
Oh,
so it was just to cover his own personal, actions, which were illegal. So much things that he did illegal. So she's not only trying to get him removed, she's also trying to get all the money that they took paid back, right? So millions of dollars that that was fraudulent, and then to have the organization completely dissolved. I'm telling you what, she came at it, and I got to say, in things that are for the cause of justice in the world, she's, not to mention all of her investigation into the Trump organization. So anyway, go Letitia James.
Yes, I voted for her back in the day. I'm proud supporter still.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the thing about it was interesting. The other day, somebody said to me, and it was at a dinner, and they said churches should not have tax exempt status. And of course, there's lots of debate about that. And I thought about that today, that comment, when I found out, as I thought about the fact that the NRA, which is clearly a political organization, has had tax exempt status for its entire history. That means this has not paid any taxes on all that money that they've made. Anyway, a very interesting time. What's on your mind? Yeah.
Well, of course, there's all this conversation about Nicole Hannah-Jones being denied tenure at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Right here in the great state of North Carolina. I mean, I won't say how I really feel about UNC Chapel Hill, because I went to a school up the street, and you know how rivalries are on Tobacco Road. But in this particular case, it was a real shame. When I saw the announcement that she had been hired, I thought, wow, that was a big deal, because that required some considerable recruitment and was a huge move for the School of Journalism there. And so I thought that was a big deal. But then for this tenure, which has never happened before, never ever has anyone, let alone someone with her remarkable achievements and qualifications and honors and awards, been denied tenure. So it's purely political. And of course, it's purely political in relationship to this growing right-wing attack on critical race theory, and what that meant for her 1619 project and her tenure. So again, a real life example of how white denial of the history of racism in America, and particularly scholarly work on racism in America, has led to something that actually hurts someone in real time, not just hurt people, oppressed people throughout the history of America, but is continuing to deny people tenure and access, and create all kinds of mess right now.
Yeah.
So
one of the things that I've been reading about on Twitter, where I, get all of my commentary, so there are those who are saying that the focus is too much on tenure and not on the larger issue, which is about inequity in hiring practices across many fields. So there's a lot of people that started coming after UNC, coming after academia in general, because traditionally Black women of color, have had struggles getting tenure positions in these types of institutions. So there's one thing, and people are saying this is not just an academia thing. Don't throw academia under the bus as if this isn't happening in the Ernst & Young or Bank of America or whatever other.
Get your own house in order, right? Get your own house in order. Yeah.
And my thing was, it's happening in church. It happens in church all the time, with people in general.
I was on a call the other day, and someone prayed that the church would pay their clergy a living wage. That was their prayer. and it was a clergy person
Mm.
praying on a call, like a Zoom call with a bunch of people, praying that the church would pay not their employees, their clergy a living wage.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's tough to hear. It's tough to hear. We got a lot of work to do in the church on equity.
And the other critique that I heard were from a lot of the historian Twitter, who a lot of them had issues with the 1619 project, which I understand from their point of view. They felt like the journalistic effort was what it was, but from a historian standpoint, it didn't even scratch the surface. It didn't even go deep enough to piss people off in the way they were pissed off. So just imagine have some of the history actually been unveiled, what the naysayers would be saying. I mean, by the time and we talked about this, I think, in a couple of episodes ago, by the time a lot of these projects like Judas and the Black Messiah or any of these like historical films get to Hollywood or get to a big enough platform like New York Times where they can get some play, they've already been watered down significantly. So just imagine your visceral reaction to something that has been watered down. You aren't even scratching the surface of what really happened, right? And so that part of Twitter was sort of talking about that as well.
Oh yeah, it's interesting because like the 1619 project came out at about the time when I was finishing up my project for my dissertation. I was really excited to read it and went through it, and I was hoping that there would be like an article or something that I could use, because I wanted to connect what was in that because it was kind of a zeitgeist moment for America, and especially because it was the anniversary. It was the 400-year anniversary, so I thought it would be a perfect connection. But as powerful as the articles were, I loved all the articles. I listened to the podcast, read it all, bought a bunch of commemorative copies of it. There wasn't one that spoke directly to the question of whiteness in a powerful enough way that I felt like it was right for the curriculum. So that being said, when folks are going through the whiteness process, already they're discovering even more depth to the history than what's in the 1619 project that we're doing in our church. And so the idea that somehow not just the project herself, but her hiring would cause this much controversy is an example of where we are in it shows us where we are at this particular moment. There is an attempt happening, not unlike what took place in the 80s after the Black Power movement began to dissolve because of attacks by the FBI and the federal government. There was a move toward colorblindness, and that similar kind of a new form of colorblind racism is rearing its head in a form, what I consider like a new McCarthyism. This idea we can't even talk about what really happened, or analyze it critically without being anti-American.
Yeah.
Right. And so now it's like when you couldn't critique war without being anti-American. If you said anything about Nixon, you were anti-American. If you said anything about Vietnam, you were anti-American. Now you can't say anything about race without being considered to be anti-American. So it's another form of censure, right? And here's the real fun irony, coming from the folks that are raising all kinds of hoopla about cancel culture. Now get out. Who got canceled? Kaepernick got canceled.
Yeah.
Let's talk about cancel culture. Who cancels people, right? And then folks on the left, don't get upset, don't get confused about Me Too and all that, right? That's accountability. We're talking about who cancels people, right? Kaepernick can't get a job. You're trying to cancel not only people, but trying to cancel Nikole Hannah-Jones' tenure. You're trying to cancel an entire field of scholarship because we don't want to hear the truth, right? So anyway, there's so much in the media that, in the conversations about this stuff that is so trite and meaningless. But I do think this one, while I think it is completely, it's just a sign of buffoonery to try to resist critical race theory. On the other hand, I do see it as dangerous because it's easy for white people will do anything they can to not take accountability or to avoid responsibility and to live in denial and to pretend like race doesn't matter and to go back under that warm blanket. So I think this does pose a real challenge to folks.
And the church, big C, makes that very easy for people. The church is the warm blanket for many people to crawl under and to get their racism absolved every Sunday for 30 minutes before they go back to being racist again.
Exactly.
And so when you have a church that's actually trying to do the work of unpacking that, of dismantling those notions, you also are up against a sort of cancel culture, right? I know the type of hate mail that you get here, and even people within the church context who are saying, this is if you talk one more time about this, I'm leaving, or whatever the thing is, right? There's a cancel culture.
Too political, right? Yeah. As if
that cancel culture happens in church. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And it's not just so, like, I always feel like our theology should make sure it's careful to be whatever is the opposite of what the Southern Baptist Convention is saying. So it's a good way to kind of get a litmus test on where your faith is. For us, it's like, if the Southern Baptist Convention is against it, we're for it. If they're for it, we're against it. For the most part, it is usually pretty clear. They are not for transgender people, so we're for transgender people, right? They are anti-CRT, critical race theory. And so we're for CRT. We're for critical race theory because we're for the truth, right? So this is, whenever you look at, you can just kind of judge. It's sort of like I used to say, whatever the KKK was against, you should be for, right? So the KKK was not just against Black people, murdering Black people, right? And then against Latinos and immigrants. They were also against Catholics, right? So they had a religious problem. And they were also, guess what, against unions and against communism and against socialism and against any other economic model other than the one that was supporting white supremacy. So it's a part of helping us understand that all these issues, if the KKK thought race and economics were linked, you should too.
And faith.
And faith, yeah, because they're basically a religious police force. That's what the KKK was.
Yeah,
a religious vigilante police organization.
Yeah,
that's crazy, right? I mean, and economic. They were also an economic organization. Yeah, so I think that's really important for us to be. I hear a lot of schools. I have people calling me now. The public schools and private schools are fighting this same battle that churches are struggling with as well. So, right, how do we talk to our kids when we can't? How do we teach race without being able to talk about critical race theory? And you've got parents coming to the schools and saying, you can't talk about that with my kid, or I'm pulling my kid, or I'm pulling my funding for your private school, And so one of the things that I'll say about that, I before we move on, Mia, is I think some folks are going to have to think creatively about pivoting away from CRT to a deeper critique. And by that, I mean, critical race theory did not originate out of nowhere, and it was not invented by the liberal establishment because they were, wanted to make sure everybody thought they were racist or hate America. That's not where it came from. A lot of people who are talking about it really don't have a clue what it is right now, especially politicians who are telling people that they should be against it. They don't have a clue what it is. But there is a deeper tradition that is actually far more important than critical race theory, and that is the Black intellectual tradition from which critical race theory is born, which is a much later development. So my feeling is, like, if you hadn't figured out what Baldwin has told you, you don't need to be reading any critical race theory. You need to go back and read Bell Hooks, go back and read Toni Morrison, go back and read Baldwin. You don't need to be reading any scholarly stuff. You don't need to read any academic, work. Go back and read W.E.B. Du Bois. Yeah. In the 1920s. You hadn't figured out what he said. So how are you going to now jump over here and tell us we shouldn't even be reading anything from critical race theory? All critical race theory is trying to analyze what the Black intellectual tradition has told us about America and about white people and about the history of America. And so basically that's the thing that makes me the most mad about these attacks, is really they're attacking the Black intellectual tradition. But I also say, well, when they do that, then forget CRT for a while. Stop worrying about it if it's going to be politically divisive, and just make people go back and read the Black intellectuals. Go back to the 20s. Nobody understood what they said. That we haven't figured that out yet, right?
No.
We haven't figured any of that mess out. So
no.
Anyway. That's my. I'm off my soapbox on that. But goodness,
This week in the news has been a lot.
it has.
And there's still ongoing strife in Israel and Palestine, and
Right.
I've been talking to a few people who, interesting enough, I had a conversation with Rabbi Dusty class today we were talking about the difference between the Christian interpretation of the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish interpretation, and how we view a lot of those Isaiah passages and the prophetic passages as pointing to Jesus, and how they view it as pointing to land, right? Like God has promised us land. We are the Messiah, in my terms, my words, this is my words. The Messiah is not a person, but God is pointing us to reconciling with this land that we've been exiled from. That's the messianic promise in many ways, right? And so I was telling her about how dangerous that is for Christians, because we took that land promise littered throughout the Hebrew Bible, and Manifest Destiny came over here and killed people over land. But she was like, some Jewish people have done the same thing as it relates to land. And we were reflecting on the turmoil and the tension, and what does it mean to practice the Jewish faith and to also hold tension with, we may not be reconciled with the land or reunited with that particular land the way we thought we were, right? But what is it like to hold those two things in tension? Like, maybe we need to reimagine what these land promises are. And so I thought that was interesting, and just reflecting on it. And I know that it's just, it can easily fall out of the news cycle. I mean, they've already moved on in many ways to something else. So just reminding people of what's going on in that part of the world.
Yeah, and I think the connection between justice issues is so important, and the religious foundations, as we've talked about so many times here, how a toxic religious theological vision can lead to historic violence, and has so many different times. A misinterpretation, or even just an interpretation that's right, that's misapplied, can lead to just generations and generations of violence by people in power.
Yeah. So prayers that way. Today's topic, friends, is decolonizing liturgy and other things. And I wanted to first open with a quote. I am rolling out, by this time I will have rolled out the first session of the course called Decolonizing Liturgy here at Myers Park Baptist Church. And one of these readings that's on the list, suggested readings, is by a man named Richard Pitt, and it's called Fear of a Black Pulpit. Real racial transcendence versus cultural assimilation in multicultural churches. And I found this article because I was looking up Gerard Marty, who's a friend of the church. And so Marty is quoted throughout this article because he writes a lot about churches, particularly evangelical. But I think Marty writes about a lot of different racial groups, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we got to have him back. He's
he writes on Latino churches. He's got a whole book on Latino congregations, his Latinx congregations in America. He's got a great book of Worship Across the Racial Divide, which to me was actually one of my teachers in helping move the church down a road on some major questions that we were struggling with. Like, for instance, what does it mean to become a racial justice focused church, anti-racist congregation? That book really helped me avoid some pitfalls.
Yeah, he's brilliant, and this person who's writing this article is referencing and quoting him a lot, and sort of tagging off of him. One of the quotes at the end of the article reads, "Multiracial churches, in spite of their composition, retain mostly white characteristics, even when whites are outnumbered by other racial groups. Why then are only non-whites, and particularly blacks, assumed to be consumed by the dominating influence of race? Why is the analytical lens almost exclusively focused on the power of race on non-whites' religious behavior?" Part of the argument that he's making in this piece is that the non-whites groups are always sort of making concessions and assimilating to the dominant culture, even when the dominant culture is no longer majority. And I experienced that in New York. I was explaining to somebody, what is it like to go to a white church that is not pastored by a white person? And the 400 years of history of white domination in the Reformed Church of America is in the soil. Even if we began to outnumber the white group, right? It was still a white church. And so how do you begin to decolonize liturgy in these settings? And so I wanted to allow some time to reflect on some of the changes we've made in worship over the pandemic that we were forced to make in many ways, but also as we've transitioned back to in person, how some of those changes have lingered. What were the things we felt were important to bring back, like the Lord's Prayer? And is this, and this is a question that some of the people that I interviewed, some of the Black clergy that I interviewed who work in white dominant spaces, is the multiracial church project gonna sink or swim? Like it's an ongoing question we have. Is this viable? And that's what I heard from several people. And there are people who are like, yes, we can make this happen. The work is real. It's happening. And there are others that are like, it's still up in the air for me. I've been working in this church for 7 years and I don't even know if the project is viable. So anyway, that's sort of the basis of the course. And I wanted to allow some space for you or for both of us to talk about the change in liturgy and your reflections on that first worship service where we came back and experienced it live with people in the seats.
Well, I feel like to tell this story, I got to go back a little bit. Before I arrived, the church had been discerning a shift away from predominantly traditional white Western European classical tradition, which had been its bread and butter and almost exclusively what its tradition had been, and also a very praised tradition, one where they had excelled in their ability to practice that tradition over the years. And when I'm talking about choral music, I'm talking about hymnody, even collecting their own hymnal. I'm talking about lots of music ministers with doctorate degrees who are at the top of their field, musicianship at some of the highest levels of musicianship, working with symphonies, orchestras. Incredible cutting albums. Our church had albums that they cut and sometimes went on choir tours and, just an amazing practice of the tradition of the music. And then, but got to a point where they realized they had to do something. Now, a lot of churches faced that with the worship wars of the late 80s and early 90s of CCM music and the battles, particularly white churches, the battles over guitars and screens in the sanctuary and having a contemporary service or whatever they want to call it. And then having two services and splitting the congregation. Myers Park generally avoided that, which in some ways is really good because that was a terrible fight and really didn't go anywhere for the church, in my opinion. Certainly not theologically. It didn't help anybody. And it certainly hadn't liberated any white people from their ridiculous theology. So anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. But it did mean that we postponed a discussion that we should have had. And when I arrived, a group of laity had gone through a process of studying whether or not to have alternative services, that was what they were calling them at the time. And they had brought in a couple of different groups to lead services, a contemplative service, which how that is distinguished from our service is something to think about. And then to look at, they had a group come in with like sort of an acoustic guitar kind of thing going on. And not a lot of people showed up for these alternative services and so all the data and research went into a 3-ring binder that was on a shelf when I arrived. And so there was a knowledge that we had studied this, we had looked at it, but we weren't sure whether people really wanted it. Although it was a major part of my conversation in coming and a major part of my discussion with the search committee. And I felt like it was something we needed to talk about when I arrived. So it was something we began to work on. And we brought in a couple of different folks to talk about liturgy. We had James K.A. Smith or Jamie Smith come and do an entire weekend event on liturgy and out of that, we wrote anew a theology of worship for the church with a team of lay leaders that you can still find on our website, and as well in our order of worship from time to time. That gives a basic outline of why we do what we do and where those things come from, biblically speaking, and that gives a general guideline, but does not prescribe, for instance, what musical tradition should be in worship. So that's sort of where my work came in, and working with Fran, particularly first off when she was here, but then with Matt now recently, in bringing in diverse forms of musical expression. We started, of course, our first experiment, gosh, it's now been almost 4 years that we've been doing this, with jazz. And we had actually a jazz service in an evening on a Friday, and I think it was attended by, 40 people. And that's where it all began. We started from there, and we moved. We tried a bluegrass service at first that just didn't seem to work theologically, because the songs were all by and by, pie in the sky, heaven, eschatological distance theology. And then we tried a rock service, which when we landed that with Randy Franklin and Sardines, it was mind-boggling how many people showed up for that and how popular that was. And we were not, but the key difference there is we did not sing CCM songs. We sang actual, what we would call secular rock songs. I don't know what secular means anymore, but rock songs that were popular rock songs. And so now we've been on this journey now for 4 years, and in when the pandemic hit, we were forced, because the choir could not gather, to think very creatively about music. And we couldn't, we were forced to have either one person singing a hymn and us following along, which felt really hard, or just a few choir members with masks singing music that is meant to be very expressive, and yet it was just so hard to do that well, or bringing in diverse groups to help us. And so that's what we began to do. We began to expand our diversity in worship. We went from not just having jazz and rock, which we continue to do with Randy Franklin and the jazz ensemble with Dawn and Greg and OC and others, and Sean Higgins. But we've also then began to have indigenous music with Jim Brock and Little Eagle, and then we had a different kind of bluegrass with the Aldridge family come in and do Brooke Aldridge and that crew. And so we began to diversify, and it's changed the way we do worship. It's changed the way worship feels from time to time. It's not like we're departing from choral music completely, or abandoning our roots in Western European classical tradition. We continue to do that and try to do that at the highest quality that we have. That's what Matt's degrees are primarily in, but we're continuing to integrate into our worship other forms and styles, and then sometimes, like we did on Pentecost in our first one back, do them together, collaborate with them together. There's an old bad word people said, they used to call that blended worship, which of course nobody liked because it made everybody upset, But if you can do it well, it's really more like a hybrid service. So on Sunday, a lot of people, some people would say, oh, it was a service primarily of jazz with a few traditional choral pieces thrown in. Well, actually, that's not exactly true. We had a jazz ensemble, but they did a lot more than jazz. They did an spiritual, an African-American spiritual, Every Time I Feel the Spirit. They did some blues music. They did gospel, straight up Black gospel tradition music. They did hymns. They did hymn arrangements. They did, and then the choir did a Western classical piece from Lawrenson, and then the collaboration that came through. And then they did a piece that was almost Latin inspired at the end, that sounded like almost Cuban influence for the end of the service. So that's a wide variety. Now, it may seem like it was all jazz because it was the jazz ensemble, but it's actually probably the most diverse variety of music that we've had in worship in my time here, and also sung with such diverse voices. And as you could tell, for those who were there, more people really got into it. There was a lot of clapping, maybe also because we couldn't sing, but there was a lot of clapping, a lot of movement. It was a different atmosphere in worship. People were so excited to be there. Had a lot of positive feedback about the service. It was an intense and beautiful experience for our members. So, yeah, I mean, what do you want to dive into there, Mia? What comes up for you as you hear about all that?
I mean, hearing the work that has been done around it is encouraging. And I also feel like people don't have the theological languages to discuss their feelings, whether it's good or bad, right? So, so many of us, and I speak for a variety of people from a variety of traditions, have had poor liturgical education. It used to be a time where in certain churches, I grew up going to Catholic school for a little bit, and I went to Mass quite often. You know, my friends who went through catechism, they had a liturgical understanding of what was happening, why they were doing what they were doing, when they were supposed to stand up and sit down and cross their hands on their forehead and it was something that you went through a program. And I get the similar feeling from my colleagues and friends who have gone through bat and bar mitzvahs, that there is a liturgical education. I do not get the sense of that from many traditions that are Reformed. And part of that, which in the course we read a piece about what is Reformed liturgy and is it still relevant? Part of that is because Reformed liturgy, like Baptist churches, is autonomous.
Oh, yeah.
You can do whatever you want to do and kill whatever you want to kill and give birth to whatever you want to give birth to. And that makes it hard to teach that across traditions. Because you go to one Baptist church and they're doing one thing, and you go to the Presbyterian up the street and it's doing something else, and they're still saying they're Reformed liturgically, and you're going to the UCC church down the street and they're doing something else, but they're saying they're also Reformed. So we have challenges, and I want to provide an opportunity for people to study what they're experiencing on Sunday, but in a theological way, right? And not so much, the theology of worship, but really looking at people's assessments of liturgy. Is what we were doing 50 years ago even relevant to the current community? If the people are the liturgy, then the liturgy would have to change every year, every 2 years, whenever our turnover is, every 4 years, like college. The liturgy is always changing. So I'm saying that to say, I think that the work that we've done with the services is amazing, and it's been a lot of clergy pushing. And I would love for more people to understand on a deeper level the decisions we're having to make, and as it relates to their participation in community, right?
Yeah. One of the things there's so much packed in what you said, and one of them is, what is liturgy? You kind of referenced it by saying the work of the people. And if it is the work of the people, then it must be different, because the people are different. The people have changed. The world has changed. The way people live has changed. The way they think has changed. The way they talk has changed. And so to be a fresh expression of worship in the 21st century, we have to think about who are the people that are creating this work together now. And that's changed for us. Our church is more diverse racially than it once was. It's more diverse economically. It's more diverse in terms of sexuality and gender. It's more diverse this is the big one for liturgy. It's more diverse in background theologically and denominationally. So when you think that someone might be able to come into our church and understand what's taking place, that is actually now no longer a safe assumption. So people are coming in with wild backgrounds. We're getting people who are showing up never having been churched at all, wondering why are they doing certain things. We got other people showing up having been totally churched for their whole lives in evangelical communities, also wondering why are we doing what we're doing. We got people coming from Catholic and Episcopalian backgrounds. We got people from Presbyterian, Methodist, Black church traditions, UCC, Mennonite, etc. All these different backgrounds. So, and it's hard to say on one hand that our theology as a congregation is wide open and each person is free to form their own theological expression, and yet we've chosen theologically a particular form of liturgy that, when in reality Baptist churches have not been traditionally reformed liturgical spaces, but free spaces. Freedom of worship is one of the 4 fragile freedoms of what it means to be Baptist. And it means that our worship we are free to change our worship and make it whatever we want it to be. Which is how we got to mega churches in America. They were mostly Baptist evangelical spaces. But it's also how we got all kinds of other expressions of faith, like the Black church and, different forms of music and wild creative expressions of liturgy as well. So we are free. The thing that we have to keep saying is we are free. And in fact, our covenant requires us to continually examine, to sustain, it says, a critical examination of Scripture, belief, and ritual. And liturgy is a ritual. And we often say, oh, yes, we love critical examination of Scripture. We don't even sure we need it. Who cares about Scripture? We love critical examination of belief. We're not even sure we have to believe. And then we get to the ritual and we're like, no. I don't want any critical examination there. No, thank you.
Yeah.
We want to keep that. We're going to keep that as it is, no change, right?
Yeah.
Don't critically examine this.
And that is one of the, in Myers Park Baptist is not unique in this. This is I would say an issue with white mainline-esque churches, denominations, who are progressive. So a lot of the work that I do is not dealing with the evangelical spaces. I'm dealing with the progressive spaces who have made these tremendous strides theologically over the course of their lifetimes, and yet liturgically is struggling. And one of the things, and I'm glad we don't have that issue here, but one of the things that a lot of clergy said was it wasn't the senior pastor, or maybe they were the senior pastor, that was halting them. It wasn't even some of the members, it was their music director.
Ooh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, it's interesting. When James K. Smith was here, he pulled me aside and he said, the only people that are like you or that I can find in ecclesial life that I know of are Catholics in Canada. And I was like, what? He said, yes, Catholics in Canada tend to be latitudinarians on doctrine and fundamentalists on liturgy. And unfortunately, we have often become latitudinarians on doctrine, which means completely free, no doctrine. You don't have to believe anything except, and then when it comes to the liturgy, fundamentalists. Here's why I believe that is. And we also have that same problem with how we think about the building and grounds. Fundamentalists,
which is a part of the liturgical space.
Right, it's space. It's all tied together, right? Sacred space, sacred acts together are written up with one another, like a cathedral in Europe is tied to a particular liturgical expression.
Right.
So they're all united, like you're saying. And one of the things that I sometimes wonder about that is I think that happens because when you decide theologically that the belief in Christ's divinity or the Trinity and 3 persons or Scripture's authority over life and faith is no longer dogmatic, meaning people are free, because Baptists have always said liberty of conscience. You can believe whatever you want. In fact, we're not even going to compel you to believe. So that's why our church is filled with a lot of wonderful atheists as well, who are there for community and fellowship and not just there for religious education or worship necessarily. So we have to remember that, right? That's a big part of it. We don't demand that they be believers to be a part of our community, because that's what it means to be Baptist, right? Is to give that soul freedom. But what happens is as human beings, we have to have something that's holy.
Yeah.
So this is just basic anthropology. We will invest sacred significance somewhere. And when we migrate sacred significance away from Jesus and Scripture and away from dogma and doctrine, the natural place for it to go is music, liturgy, and buildings. That's the place where it goes. And we become almost more fundamentalist about that than we would ever have been about doctrine.
Yeah.
And because it's called the migration of the holy. The holy migrates from one place to another, and what we used to consider as holy, maybe like Jesus, we now consider the building holy, right? Or worship holy, or liturgy holy. It's really interesting how that operates as a principle of anthropology.
Yeah, and if you have the privilege enough to redirect those resources to redesignate the holy as the building, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking about, there are certain traditions that are wealthy. The United Methodists, not all United Methodist churches, but the tradition, the denomination, Presbyterians, wealthier Baptist churches. There's a lot of wealthy kinds of churches, right? And you have the privilege to have this building that is so sacred and holy, that the chandeliers are always shining and there's no missing lights, that the lights come on, because I've been to some churches where it was a gamble every Sunday if the light bill was going to get paid.
Yeah.
And that there's a privilege in those traditions to be able to redirect, whereas in many other traditions, particularly of, I would say a class level that does not have this kind of wealth, or Black and brown people, you can't worship the building. It's not, yes, you do, but it's sacred, but not in the same way.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I was on a call the other day with a laity and clergy on the same call, and I got put into a breakout group with some laity from another church in Kentucky. And we were asked to talk about, what does our church spend the most time talking about? Or what does your church spend the most time trying to protect? And of course I said, well, we talk a lot about buildings and grounds, facilities, maintaining them, preserving them. And the guy said, he was an older man in this church. He said, oh, wow, that used to be I'm the head of the stewardship committee, the treasurer. And that used to be all we talked about. And then a business offered to buy our property from us. And we weren't sure we wanted to do it, but they made an offer that we could not refuse. And we did it. And now we never talk about the building, never talk about facility. It never comes up. It's not a distraction from the work of ministry. It's not a constant drain on our budget. They have a building, they have a facility, they like it, they have their sanctuary, but they don't have to deal with all this other stuff. And that's not in the cards for every congregation, but it does help you evaluate where, what is at stake on your campus. What are people forced to spend time and energy and mental brain space and money in order to take care of, that can sometimes be a distraction from not only the worship of a church, but the entire ministry and mission of an organization.
Yeah. Woo! I have so much there. That's another episode. Okay. We need oh my gosh. The privilege, and this will be my last piece on this privilege part, but the privilege to spend the amount of time that we have spent talking about things that don't affect people's material needs it's a privilege. And I want people to name that, even as we're talking about liturgy, the privilege to even argue about, is there going to be a confession or not? Or does this affect the material needs of the people? And in reading some of the content that we're reading in the course, Claudio Carvallis will say no. When you are pastoring poor folk in South and Central America who don't even have a building, and their ritual is new every Sunday. And I really want people to imagine a liturgy that is new every Sunday. You don't know what you're going to expect. That is church. That's community. Somebody might get up and start running around the sanctuary. That's just, I used to be members of churches like that, right? So that's just the way it is. And you just never know what you're going to get. And that's sort of, if it's meeting that person's material need in that moment, that's what it is. And so how do we do community with people who have a different need than us?
Well, I think that is already, I'm thinking about the prophets when you say that, because, it's pretty clear prophetically in the Bible that God does not appreciate worship that is done where there is no justice being done, where the people are not living life of justice in their community, God says, I abhor that worship. Let justice flow down like an everlasting stream, right? So many of the major and most important quotes we often proof text from the prophets come at the end of them on a diatribe about how your sacrifices and your worship I hate. I abhor your festivals. I abhor your liturgical traditions. I abhor your lectionary. Unless it's leading to justice, unless it's leading to mercy, unless it's leading to humbly walking with God, I know I'm not interested. I don't want it. Right? Unless it's leading to a fast that takes care of the poor and houses people and advocates for just policy, I don't want that worship. I'm not interested in that worship. So God is pretty clear through the prophets about that. However, the problem is when we have distanced liturgy from theology and been latitudinarian on our theology, the worship no longer has a theological basis for why we're doing what we're doing. It only has tradition on which to found itself, and that is shifting sand right there. There's nothing about that can be anchored into an understanding of what it means to be a people. So I think it's interesting that you bring up this unpredictability of someone dancing through the sanctuary, which would make a lot of our members go absolutely crazy and have a panic attack, or annoy them greatly, right, and distract them in worship. I think we have come. That makes me wonder. I'm not sure. I mean, I probably have my thoughts on this, but it makes me wonder if sometimes what we're using liturgy for is to contain the holy and to box in an experience of the holy that we can manage and that we can control. So it's not the work of the people, it's the control of God, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, and who are the people? And who gets to make the decision, right? Who gets to sit at the table and say, it's going to be this, it's going to be that. And even perhaps even clergy have to be rethinking this, right?
Yeah, we got some members who would prefer dancing in worship, but they're not usually going to be chosen to be on the ministry of worship and music.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's also a question of power.
Yeah.
Now Paul does say things about worship being orderly, but that's a totally different concept than worship being controlled, right? How does a Christian community worship in the Spirit when the Spirit is absolutely uncontrollable by nature? So when we say worship in spirit and in truth, sometimes all we got is truth, right? And we're not letting the Spirit do much movement among us. It doesn't mean that we have to abandon all of our traditions, right? And some of them may need to stay or be reimagined, but there is this sense where there needs to be some spontaneity, some openness to the movement of the Spirit among us. I thought it was interesting. One of the things about Sunday that was so interesting, that was an old debate that died on the floor that day, was whether or not a person should clap in worship. I used to be, early on in my tenure here, I was counseled to discourage clapping. Even after like a powerful piece of testimony by someone or a powerful piece of music, how do you control behavior like that? I don't know. I mean, that seems odd to me, but people really didn't appreciate it. They thought that clapping was inappropriate in a sacred space. Now, I do think there are questions that we should ask about why do we clap for some things and not others. But on Sunday, we were invited to clap, and people began clapping. Even a bunch of white people trying to get on 2 and 4. Mia, some folks got there. They
did. It didn't sound bad from the balcony. So
wasn't too bad. They weren't all on 1 and 3. Some of them on 2 and 4. They're holding it down.
We are open to all. So I am open to the 1, the 3, the 5, and the 7, and the 9.
Sometimes, as Dawn does, you just keep. You got the 1 and 3.
That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, I thought it was really powerful because sometimes on a more reverential piece, a more contemplative piece, that's maybe less about praise and more about reflection, there was an amen as the response.
Yeah.
And there was also some talking to me during a sermon, which I love, gets me going. Over on my left side, I think it was over on the left side of the sanctuary for me. But yeah, there was a lot of response. And first of all, people who haven't been in there 14 months, they haven't had a chance to express themselves in so long. But secondarily, it was also a reflection of the change in the atmosphere.
You said something there. I know we're coming toward the end, but you said they hadn't been there for 14 months. And I wondered, in my reflection, how many people had just fallen into just a mindless routine. Now, there are some who would argue that ritual is supposed to be to a point where you can do it without thinking too hard and
Right.
blah, blah, blah. But I wonder about that. I wonder about the exuberance. And do we have church too much? Or do we have certain kinds of church too much? Like, I do think there's something about, our Catholic siblings who, do communion every week or whenever the church is open, that's communion.
Yeah.
But is there a sermon every week? Is there music all the time or a certain kind of music? I'm just wondering about, now that we have returned to something, I'm wondering about that piece, about the exuberance that existed and the bottled up need to express oneself. Where did that come from? And I hope it doesn't disappear. I don't want it to disappear.
Mm-hmm. I noticed that it began right after Tara welcomed them.
Yeah.
That was amazing to me. There would never be clapping.
Yeah.
That early in a service, but people were ready.
Yeah.
To be in that space. They were so excited about being there. And God, there were so many layers to that. Like, what is it about? I mean, I've been in churches where they're poor folks, and they are that excited every damn Sunday.
Exactly. Which is what I'm saying.
So what is it about? It took a pandemic to help us to see why we need worship. Now that's not for everybody. Some people know they're desperate. I know some people that tell me that they are struggling through the week until they can get to another Sunday.
Yeah.
They're trying to get to another Sunday.
Yeah.
That's their life. Right. But then there's a lot of others who don't even think about it. So, they may come once a month. They don't really need it. They come because they feel obligated or whatever they come, or just it's a habit for them. And we love all that. That's all fine. But why is it that the exuberance came, at that moment? I do think there's something for us to reflect on about that. And how do we cultivate more opportunities like that? Or how do we shape a theological belief system that helps people understand how desperate we all really are?
Yeah.
So that's for true worship, regardless of our economic circumstances.
Yeah.
But if the worship isn't speaking to the privileged soul, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you're not going to be exuberant like that, right? It's got to be both speaking to the oppressed, and it has to be speaking. It's a different word often, but it has to be speaking to both people and recognizing the desperation in both places.
And to end on that, is that project viable?
I don't know.
I mean, I don't know. I'm throwing it out there. Thinking about viability. Is that even possible? I had a professor in seminary, Dr. Cruz, who was also a pastor. He was the only professor that I had who was actively pastoring at the time, and he would say no. He said no. I mean, his thing. He's a Lutheran pastor. He's like, nah. I'm not wasting my time trying to build, multicultural. He's a Latinx guy, and he's like, I'm not wasting my time. He's like, if people want to come to my church, yes, but he felt like it was to be attending to the needs of the gentrifiers that were coming in his neighborhood, and trying to create things. He felt like it was a waste of his time, and that the oppressed should always take center stage.
Yes, I agree with part of him, what he's saying, and I would say, I think I had his theology up until I had members of our own congregation and staff. I'm not blaming you here, Mia, but and staff who said, Pastor, you got to figure out how to speak to everybody in your congregation.
Yeah.
So if the project is not viable, then I don't need to do that.
Yeah. I don't know the answer. I wasn't saying it was.
But I think that's an interesting point, right? Because I think I've been persuaded, and I think the problem is I don't believe the project needs attention the way that others think it needs attention. Because I'm not out here trying to build a multicultural church. I'm trying to just build a faithful church. I don't care. I just want people who are following justice and Jesus and whatever, and trying to build a better community and building relationships with each other and including and loving people. I don't care if our church is 100% white or 100% black or totally mixed. I want us to be faithful and just. And that's not really what happens, is what God is doing. To me, it's like we don't choose who comes. That's a thing God is doing in the Spirit now. But if I didn't believe something of what he said, I'd be lying. So that's the part of it, what he's saying that I do believe. But then the other side is I actually have to figure out how to do my job regardless. So yeah. I would say, yeah, he's got to figure out, yes, how to elevate the poor and the oppressed in every worship service and preach to the gentrifier. I mean, I don't think you can leave the gentrifier alone. You've got to talk to the white folks. You've got to talk to the folks of different economic backgrounds. So you got to figure out how to, what do they say, that you have to code switch? Yeah.
That's an excellent podcast. You should go listen to. If you don't listen to Code Switch, go listen to that.
Yes.
Well, this has been a fruitful conversation. We can go on and on. We have to do a part 2 at some point.
Talk forever.
Yeah, there's so much here. And if you are interested in the course, please do sign up. There's sessions all summer. And also, if you just want the syllabus, I will send you the syllabus. I think that it's important for us to read other people's assessment of liturgy and worship and not always be sitting in our own context and communities. And to also particularly hear with people of color, their assessments of the project of being multicultural or multiracial or multi-ethnic, whatever the language is, merging, and not even just regarding race. I'm thinking about Pentecostalism and how that is Black, white, and Latin and everything, right? Yeah. So what is it like to embrace the Pentecostal and who walks through the door in our context, right? So I encourage you to do that.
I hope folks will sign up for the course, man. I think there's a lot of fruit that's going to come from it for our church and for the individuals who participate. If you've been through a What Does It Mean to Be White group, this is a perfect summer follow-up for you to go through this group and to kind of figure out how these questions impact your worship that you've been struggling with related to whiteness and colonization and being either a colonizer or the subject of colonization. And then I just want to say, folks, Mia got a grant for this from one of the greatest universities in America, from Duke. And I know all the Chapel Hill people are like, damn it, Ben. Anyway, but yeah, Mia got a grant for this. Let's support this project that institutions are investing in our clergy and in our church with. So I hope folks will sign up.
Yes. That's all for today, folks. Join us next week for more of Sacred Justice.
Woo-hoo.
Take care.
Peace.
Friends, that was our episode this week. As always, please email your questions and your suggestions to Reverend Mia McLean at mmcclain@myersparkbaptist.org. Until next time, take care. This is Sacred Justice.